Obviously, this is going to have some spoilers for Donkey Kong Bonanza, and I would recommend you play the game yourself first if you haven't yet, but there's your warning. So I've been busy the last few weeks. This YouTube comment sums it up. After finishing the story, I've seen a lot of discourse online about the DK timeline. A bunch of comments in my last video on the subject were saying my take aged like milk, and I was really confused reading them, asking myself, did we play the same game? For whatever reason, there's a prevailing narrative that Bananza is a prequel to Odyssey. The evidence? Pauline wears a hat. Okay, I'm goofing. There's a Champions Road type of level at the end of this game, and your prize for suffering through this ostrich torture chamber is another ending image. Here we see Pauline doing a City Hall concert reminiscent of the one that happens in Super Mario Odyssey. She's even wearing the same outfit. So case closed, right? I'm not so sure. If this is your current understanding of the Donkey Kong story, that's fine. I'm not here to police the internet on how they interpret the monkey game. What I am here to do is shed light on why I think Bananza is a distant sequel to Odyssey, and express that despite all the rhetoric on Nintendo not caring about lore or continuity, I think there is a true DK timeline with no roundabout considerations that you have to make to observe it. Discussions on the subject of a Kongtinuity, if you will, have to account for all of these inconsistencies, like the rare DK capturing Pauline in Mario vs. Donkey Kong, or why DK is boxing with Little Mac, fighting Bayonetta, or racing with Bowser, but it's way simpler than that. Before I get too ahead of myself, however, let's talk about why Bananza probably doesn't fit as an Odyssey sequel. Pauline is in the game as a child, so at first glance, seeing that image would make sense. I imagine this is spreading online so fast because the picture is evocative of that special festival in Mario Odyssey. This is supposed to call back to that game, but not for the reason you might think. The issue comes in a closer look at the game's overall story, something you would have to dump over 10 hours of gameplay into to get through the whole plot of the game. Additionally, you would have to witness a few key text boxes and conversations that are not even mandatory when you're running through the story. This is by design, as there are enough breadcrumbs to trace continuity between titles, but the timeline isn't really the focus of the game's story. At the core, the story is meant to be easy to understand so that the youngins playing this game can follow along regardless of how many Donkey Kong games they've played before. At the same time, there's all this surrounding history, lore, and continuity for the older folks to latch onto. So what optional dialogue am I referencing here? It starts with Cranky. You can speak to him as early as the Lagoon layer, and while he tells you that he's after some sort of banana bandit, he mentions his distaste for DK's rival. Rivals in his day had charisma and wore overalls. This is an overt reference to the Donkey Kong arcade game, which features Mario and Pauline, as we all know. But wait, how is Pauline referenced as an adult by Cranky, but here she is sitting on Donkey Kong's back? We'll get there. First, let's continue our understanding of Cranky's history. Some people are taking these fossils at face value, like Professor Chops literally got encased in stone, but these collectibles are meant to be meta-referential, as fitting as it would be for Chops to be trapped in stone forever. There are not 10 identical Professor Chopses that are all so old they're buried deep under the planet's surface. It's not meant to be taken literally. They're meta-commentaries on past Donkey Kong titles, and not the long-lost remnants of that beaver you demolished in 1994. So if fossils aren't literal, why am I bringing them up? In the Planet Core, we have fossils to collect that harken back to the arcade era. We got the barrels, Pauline's items, and a double-wide 8-bit DK. The description here alludes to what we've known for decades. Cranky was the original Donkey. Again, while these fossils aren't literal, this description shows that Nintendo is still very much comfortable with that idea. If there was any time to break away from that core understanding of the character, it was now with the revitalization of the brand. While Cranky has been known to break the fourth wall in the past, we have 2 more mentions of the original DKC lore of this game. If this was an isolated incident, we might be able to chalk it up to mistranslation or some cheeky writing, but it all flows with the rest of the game and series. So Cranky is still the original DK. Well, that seems like it could fit in with Odyssey. Let's talk about the issues surrounding that. When DK and Pauline arrive in New Donk to challenge K. Rool, the city's looking a little different, wouldn't you say? We're in the same place as Odyssey, considering the big croc is standing on top of the same City Hall building, yet nothing looks familiar. Everything seems flung generations into the future. There are way more LED billboards, and the style of dress seems to have modernized from the classic sensibilities of Odyssey. Speaking of generations and optional text, Pauline sure does mention her grandma a lot. I first picked up on this in some of the conversations that you can have at the getaways. As you enter into more of these, she just won't stop talking about it. If you missed all that, however, right before you get to that image that has everyone assuming this is an Odyssey prequel, she mentions how Grandma will be so proud. This is a big indicator. We see Pauline as just Pauline, but she seems to be named after her grandmother. Her performance at City Hall isn't a sign of things to come, it's a callback to what has already passed. This perfectly fits into the established DK timeline that runs from the arcade games into DKC and now likely ends with Bananza. Some of you might already be typing essays into the comments section, but I'm going to ask you to hold your horses for a minute. We might just cover the concerns or plot holes that you're thinking about. Let's start with Mario's age. How could Mario appear to be the same age in the original Donkey Kong and Mario Kart with two different Donkey Kongs? Do apes age faster? I mean, yes, in real life, but I think you're asking the wrong question here. The real question is, outside of spin-off games that throw overarching storytelling to the wayside, have you ever seen the new DK alongside Mario? Although Rare's take on DK was in Mario parties, kart races, and Super Smashes, they have never been featured in a mainline game together. They're not in the same places at the same time. There's a reason for that. I don't think this is a particularly crazy way to look at it. For some reason, however, people have assumed that there's a need to cram every Nintendo game ever into one congruent timeline for it to make sense. While this is fun, and DK Vine finds real and implied connections between every game Rare has ever breathed on, do we need to connect every spin-off to one singular thread? I would argue it doesn't matter what version of Donkey Kong Mario is playing tennis with when he's also playing with a baby version of himself. There's no overarching story to the Mario Party games, and even if there was, that wouldn't really be of concern to these individual characters' storylines. This shouldn't be a controversial thing to say, but there was this whole discourse and hubbub about this when Mario Kart World came out. While fitting this stuff into the Mario spin-offs can be fun, they introduce weird questions like who Rose Gold Peach is, or how Donkey Kong Jr. can be Donkey Kong Jr. in the same game where Rare Donkey Kong is Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong is Diddy Kong. It just doesn't seem to make sense, does it? Games seem to be in this weird spot where people assume it's all or nothing, but no one is watching TV and asking where Spidey and his amazing friends slots into the MCU. There are different stories and timelines with the same character. Games can do this too. We don't have to reconcile where Mario Golf Super Rush fits into the timeline and why DK refuses to wear pants in that game. It sits in its own little bubble, as does Mario Pinball, I would imagine. Ever since Sonic started caring about lore, they try and squeeze the spin-offs into their storytelling, and that's fine, but it's totally reasonable to have those sit in their own buckets. This is often the norm in different forms of media. We have different universes for different tellings of the same sort of story. I mean, look at Into the Spider-Verse. They're making a whole trilogy out of the pantheon of different Spider-Man stories that have occurred over the character's history. We don't have to understand why Peter is a dinosaur in one of them but not the others. There are different stories using a lot of the same characters and elements. Similarly, we don't have to see where Donkey Kong Barrel Blast or Coconut Crackers fits into the overall lore. If you want to do that, that's fun. Have at it. But don't take the inconsistencies of them as some sort of bat to beat DK fans with. The only worthy challenge to this DK timeline is the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, which has been running since the early 2000s. We see a modern Mario and Donkey Kong with plenty of appearances from Pauline. Does this shatter the timeline? No. For one, these games would likely sit in that spin-off territory as they don't connect to DK games directly, just categorically. I don't think they connect to Mario that much either. They sit in their own timeline or bucket. It's arcade Donkey Kong reimagined for a younger audience. For the sake of argument though, these games could fit in the timeline as well. The Donkey Kong for these games could be Cranky, as Cranky's young design has always changed with the times. He got a big makeover in DK94, and if that game was DK95, you can bet that he would have looked a lot more like the country iteration than Miyamoto's original drawing. That being said, I feel like it's its own continuity. I don't think Nintendo is committing to the idea that Mario runs a toy company. Marvel has rebooted and reimagined their universe over a dozen times, with some of these interpretations running concurrently. Nintendo prioritizes gameplay experience first, as that's the medium they're in. Even though there's an undergirding lore in some of their games, their primary concern is that you buy it and play it. Does that mean that Nintendo doesn't care about lore? No! There are plenty of instances from the games they help produce to the ones they bake in-house that take great care in this regard. You can see the airships from Mario 3 and Super Mario World, sunken in the water rather than flying. Yoshi's Island is a prequel to the other Mario games. Some Mario RPG games tell connected stories over a bunch of games, while others start entirely fresh. Metroid has a large concurrent story, despite a bunch of plot holes and writing mistakes made in Other M. Other M is funny in particular, because I've seen it wielded as some weapon to prove that Nintendo doesn't care about timelines, but it doesn't prove that point at all. A giant chunk of the game's appeal was supposed to be the plot in storytelling and how it fit into the larger Metroid story. You could use Other M as an example of how Nintendo might be bad at managing continuity, but not as an example of them not caring about it. Some people finger wag at inconsistencies like this as proof that Nintendo hates lore, but why are games beholden to this weird standard that movies, comics, and TV shows aren't? These are just some at-a-glance examples, as I'm not any sort of authority on these other series. Let's dial into Donkey Kong more. It is totally reasonable and even likely that Paion's King of Swing duology sits in its own bucket. You could say the same for Retro's games. I'm no Mario expert, but at a glance there seems to be certain games, like the Super Nintendo ones, that carry a thread from one game to another, and others that seem to hit the reset button on the story that they're telling. Mario Galaxy 2 is pretty famous for this. And while you might be quick to say that this disproves Nintendo caring about storytelling, I would counter with the fact that the title of the game doesn't necessarily correspond with the story, it corresponds to gameplay. That's why Yoshi's Island is Super Mario World 2. It's the next take on that gameplay style, not the next chapter in a story. They rarely do this in other forms of media, which is likely why there's confusion with games. The next DK game doesn't have to slot in perfectly with the other ones, and the timeline doesn't have to account for every mainline entry for me to say that there is a timeline that runs through a bunch of these games. Let's cover what we know to be true with relative certainty. The saga starts with Cranky, Pauline, and Mario. How do we know this is Mario and not Jumpman or Mario Sr.? It's been stated ad nauseum that the Mario we know is the original Jumpman, but if you needed your yearly confirmation of that, Daisuke Watanabe just reconfirmed that 2 days before Bananza came out in an official Nintendo interview. Lots of people have made this roundabout assumption that Kong's age faster or something to square the circle, but I think the truth is that Mario's way older than our current DK, and if we saw him in the present moment in Bananza, he would probably be old like Cranky and the original Pauline are. What about DKC2, you ask? It's like the fossils of Bananza. Cranky's video game heroes isn't meant to be taken literally. They have Sonic, Earthworm Jim, Link, Mario, and Yoshi all there in some capacity. I don't think Rare was literally trying to say that all of these heroes were storming Crocodile Isle at the same time, or that all their universes are connected. At the same time, this doesn't nullify any lore or storytelling that is in the game otherwise. They were making a fourth wall breaking joke. Other Nintendo games have done this too. You can find Samus and Link napping in Super Mario RPG, or a bunch of Nintendo artifacts in Animal Crossing or Kirby Superstar. There are a bunch of meta references present in Odyssey and Bananza too. I don't think we're meant to believe that Tiny Kong literally went to Eastern Europe to break a deal with the Ukrainians and open a pierogi shop in the middle of the Mario equivalent of New York City. I'm also gonna assume that she didn't broker some sort of deal with the JP Mario Chase to become the namesake of a bank. These are similar fourth wall breaking jokes that can exist along coherent storytelling. So what story are they trying to tell? And look at the passage of time in New Donk. It seems that we're 2 generations in the future from the Donkey Kong arcade game. Those events from the arcade and DK94 happened, time passed, and then DKC began. K. Rool did battle with the Kongs over a trilogy at the very least. We know this from the conversations with Diddy and Dixie in Bananza. I would guess this timeline includes DK64 as well, given their usage of Tiny and Lanky in NDC, as well as the music and battle arena references. It's not clear if the retro games are part of this particular timeline or not, as while there is a Chops reference in Bananza, it's a collectible cameo and irrelevant to the story. Odyssey would have to be somewhere in the mix, as that's where NDC comes from. It would be placed in between the arcade games and Donkey Kong Country. As far as the other Donkey Kong games, Jungle Beat pretty obviously feels like a total reboot of the series, as does the retro games on second thought. Some other games like Diddy Kong Racing and Jungle Climber don't necessarily conflict with the sacred timeline, but I don't think they overtly belong to it. What we have here at the end is a pretty straight through line. 2 whole juggernaut franchises were birthed from the moment Cranky hit those girders, and that's not changing anytime soon. Rare probably didn't intend to create a story that spans decades, but here we are. Nintendo chose to pick up where they left off and bring the king back. You can interpret the Kremlings getting stuck in the planet core as a meta commentary of why they're not in the retro duology, but it also works with the in-universe storytelling. They might even be trying to say both. So I imagine you can make the argument for Retro's DK adventures being in or out of this timeline, but it's also entirely possible that they were doing both at the same time. All I can say for certain is that the timeline survived. Mario and Pauline are still Mario and Pauline. Cranky is still the original instigator, and all these years later, we not only got to see the Kremling story get a thrilling turn, but also a poetic end to Pauline's traumatic beginning. Both descendants of the famous trio working together to break through. The storytelling matters. It matters to Nintendo, it matters to fans. Some games pick up where the story left off, others start a new story altogether. Other games will flip an established event on its head and see where it goes. All of this is fine, and you're allowed to build whatever canon you want to. You're also allowed to not care about the timelines, as I did a couple years back. It's all chill. The argument online is that either everything is connected or there's no such thing as continuity in lore. The truth is, it's a game-by-game basis, a story-by-story basis, and ultimately whatever the artists of the original work want to do. They're allowed to connect their stories, they're allowed to start entirely new stories, they're allowed to contradict themselves and make mistakes because they didn't remember details from other video games that they made 20 years prior. And none of that changes the fact that with Donkey Kong Bonanza, they did want to connect it to larger storytelling threads that they had explored previously.